What's up, people of world history? Welcome to another episode of Mr. Owen's Lectures! Alright, guys, let's get cracking on this. I'm going to try to cover the French Revolution in under 10 minutes. Let's go. Get your notepads ready. Okay, so this is in the late 1700s. At this time, France has a king and queen. They got King Louis XVI, and they got a queen named Marie Antoinette. Okay, say it with me, Marie Antoinette. Okay, King Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette. There's three estates at this time in France. Think of it like an upper class, a middle class, and a lower class, except there's no middle class. The estates are the church. At this time, this is a Catholic country, and basically everybody's Catholic. And they have a lot of power, the Pope and any priests and things like that. The other class is the royalty. That's the king and queen, that's their friends, that's the lords, that's the people who own the land. And the church and the royalty group, they're the small percentage of people. The rest are all in one class. It's the peasant class, and it's basically everybody else doing all the work. What causes the French Revolution? It's simple. It's taxes. The other two estates, the royalty and the church, they're not getting taxed. In fact, they're taking all the taxes from the peasants. So literally, the poor people pay all of the taxes, and this is not okay. And what's going to happen is, before the French Revolution starts, there's a huge drought in France, which affects the crop of wheat, which is what you use to make bread. And this is going to drastically drive up the price of bread. So people are being taxed away all their money, and then now they can no longer afford food, and it's going to create a perfect storm. Okay, so what causes the French Revolution? Taxes and a famine. Okay, all right, so the people of France, the peasants, they go to these other classes and they go, we got to have a chat, we got to have a meeting. So they sit down in this big giant conference hall and they're having this meeting, and they want the other groups to be taxed. They want fairness, they want representation. And so they decide to take a break, and the peasants walk out of the room, and the other groups lock them out of the building and say, haha, you guys can't vote, so we're not going to pass any laws to help you out, any taxes to help you out. So these people march over to a tennis court and they sign what's called the tennis court oath. It's super famous, and they basically want changes. They want a constitution. They want the king and queen held accountable, and they want food. They want fairness. And again, that's called the tennis court oath. Why? Because it was signed on a tennis court. All right. And basically the king kind of laughs it off, and all chaos breaks loose in France. French people are unhappy, they're hungry, and they end up doing a thing called the storming of the Bastille. It's actually still celebrated in France. Bastille is a prison that only held a few people, and it mostly was filled with guns. So these people take all these guns. Now they're pissed off and they're armed. And the king has a famous quote. King Louis says to one of his servants, "What is this? Is this a riot?" And the guy says, "No, no, king, this is a revolution." So it's a revolution. And there is a huge difference between a riot and a revolution. There's a huge difference between a movement and a revolution. Okay? A movement you may be familiar with. Black Lives Matter is a movement. Gay rights is a movement. Environmental causes are movements. These are things that seek out change, typically through politics or protests. A revolution is the overthrowing of a government. Very different. Okay? So we're going to be exploring that in our first project. So just make a note of that. All right? So they storm the Bastille. They've got guns now. And to make matters worse, they're still hungry. And a rumor gets spread around France that the queen, Marie Antoinette, is hiding grains and bread. So guess who gets this revolution really going? Two snaps in a circle, ladies. Women. Women decide to march. They hike miles to the Palace of Versailles, which I've been to, and it's just outside of Paris. And all these women in Paris, they march all the way to Versailles to hold the queen accountable. Men join them along the way. But ladies, I can tell you this is super awesome. This is a super huge moment in women feminism, because the ladies get this thing going. And these women are not hiking in Nikes and Lululemon. They are hiking in corsets, in dresses, uncomfortable shoes, and they hike something like 10, 15 miles all the way to the palace. And they're like, hey, we want food, we want this, we want that. And they end up making the king and queen move from Versailles, which is just outside of Paris, back to Paris. And we want a constitution, we want all these things. And the king and queen kind of laugh it off. They get a little nervous. And Marie Antoinette, her brother, was the king of Austria, and he's nervous because he sees kings and queens losing power in France. And as a king in Austria, he doesn't like that. Nor do any of the king and queens in Europe. They're like, dude, this is bad news. So King Louis and Marie Antoinette decide to leave France. They're going to sneak out. They're going to go to Austria. They're going to come up with a plan to come back and take care of the peasants and take power again. And while he's trying to sneak out of France, he gets caught. Why does he get caught? The dude was so full of himself that he literally had his face printed on their dollar bill, and that's how people recognized him. If he hadn't put his own picture on his dollar, he would have never been caught. But he gets caught, he gets brought back, and they have a trial, and he loses by 1 vote, and they determine that he was plotting with foreign powers, and they execute him and Marie Antoinette, and they die via guillotine. What's a guillotine? It's this thing. Okay, say it with me, guillotine. All right, and what's really ironic about this is if you see the curve in the blade like it's at an angle, King Louis actually came up with that part of it. They had designed the guillotine and the blade was straight across, and King Louis said, you probably would get a much better cut if you angled the blade. So the dude helped design something that eventually caused his head to get cut off. And this is going to turn into just utter chaos in France. And it's going to lead to a time called the Reign of Terror. Say it with me, Reign of Terror. Okay, and the Reign of Terror is actually where the word terrorism comes from. So if you ever heard terrorist or terrorism, comes from the Reign of Terror. And this is a time in France where basically anybody that's for the king and against the revolution gets their head cut off. And there's this group called the Jacobins, and they're going to seize power. And this guy named Maximilien Robespierre, how do you spell that, Mr. Owen? This is how you spell that. Maximilien Robespierre. And he's going to be in charge of the Jacobins and this group called the Committee of Public Safety. What's it called? The Committee of Public Safety. And he is going to behead anybody that questions the revolution. He's going to behead anybody that likes the king, and it's straight to the guillotine. And a ton of people die in France during this time. Hence the name, Reign of Terror. It's not called the Reign of Happiness. It's not called the Reign of Rainbows. It's called the Reign of Terror. If you screw around, even if you said hello the wrong way, oh, it was like, boom, behead that guy. He's dead. Done. It's so crazy that at one point, Maximilien Robespierre goes too far, and they cut his head off. That's right, the guy that was in charge of this whole thing ends up getting his own head chopped off. Okay, so what does this lead to? Okay, this leads to a guy named Napoleon Bonaparte. Say it with me, Napoleon Bonaparte. Okay, and he is a military commander in the French army, and he is one bad mamma jamma. At this time, you were always fighting wars all over the place, okay? There's expansion going on into the Americas. France is kicking butt and taking names, and Napoleon is leading the charge. Meanwhile, in France, it's absolute chaos. So Napoleon comes back from winning a bunch of battles. He sees all this chaos, and he leads what's called a coup d'etat. Say it with me like a first minute, coup d'etat. Not how it's spelled. How do you spell it? This is how you spell it. Coup d'etat. And don't say, Mr. On, when am I ever going to use this? You are going to hear this word a lot in your life. There are coup d'etats going on now. What is a coup d'etat? It is a hostile takeover of a government, typically by the military. Okay, so he's going to take over. And why do they let him take over? Because he promises to restore order in France. And like I said, it is chaos right now. Everybody's arguing. People are chopping their heads off. The king's dead. No one's in charge. So Napoleon takes over. And Napoleon, as a leader, he absolutely rocks. He's a great leader, okay? People love him. To this day, if you go to France and you travel around Paris, you'll see little N's on buildings and on statues. Those are for Napoleon. He's still cherished over there. Okay, why does he rock? Well, he establishes the Napoleonic Code, which is a set of laws. And these set of laws lead to this period called Enlightenment, where people eventually get more freedom. Here's an example of some of the things that Napoleon brings to France for the first time. Okay, he limits the church's power with the Pope, so now they have less power. Okay, he's going to implement a fair tax code. He's going to start public schools. He's going to create a legal equality a thing where basically you would get a trial. Okay, that didn't exist before then. He creates a national bank. He allows all men, not just the rich and wealthy, to own land. Okay, he does some really, really, really cool things. All right. Oh, I'm hitting my 10-minute mark. I got to go faster. Let's go. Hang with me, okay? All right? So we have bad taxes, riots, revolution, king gets beheaded, reign of terror. Napoleon uses that to lead a coup d'etat. All right? Stay with me, people. We're almost done. All right? So at this time, like I said, France, they're kicking butt and taking names all over the world. They've got properties all over the place, including Haiti, which is a huge sugar plantation. Sugar had been discovered within the last 100 years, and they had plantations all over the Americas. It was a big deal, and it was a huge cash crop. Okay? France also owns a whole lot of the southern United States, and Napoleon decides, you know what? I want to focus on protecting Haiti, which is also rioting and wants their own freedoms. And I want to sell all this area in the southern United States so I can pay for an expansion into Europe. I want to invade Europe. So he sells this huge chunk of land, and you can see on the map, it is a huge territory, to Thomas Jefferson in the United States. This is known as the Louisiana Purchase. Okay, this is a big deal. It affects you. Now the United States got a lot bigger. And now Napoleon's going to take that money and he's going to take his troops back from the southern part of the United States. And he is going to, which was a French colony, didn't belong to the United States yet. And he's going to invade Europe. And he is going to kick butt and take names in Europe. And it's pretty impressive. And this all happens at the end of the 1700s is when Napoleon takes over. And from 1804 to 1814, Napoleon is actually going to declare himself Emperor of France. Okay, he's emperor, he's in charge, and he's going to conquer a lot of Europe. And in fact, a lot of countries in Europe are going to have to unite to fight against him. And it's going to create a thing called nationalism. Say it with me, it's super important. We're going to be learning about it for the next couple of months. Nationalism. Nationalism is the extreme pride in one's nation. Okay, it's a super, super big deal. Okay, and France is going to have all this pride from Napoleon as they're kicking butt and taking names all over Europe. And then all these countries that are occupied by Napoleon and France are going to not be happy about being conquered, and they're going to develop nationalism and pride for their countries, and they're going to start rising up to fight Napoleon. Okay? What eventually leads to Napoleon's defeat and downfall? He makes a huge mistake. He decides to invade Russia in the middle of winter, and most of his troops are going to freeze to death and die. The geography of Russia is brutal. Okay, geography, Russia, brutal. It is cold in Russia. You do not want to go there in the wintertime. Brr. And the Russians are going to use a policy called scorched earth. That means as Napoleon's moving into Russia and beating them back, every city, they just burn it to the ground rather than letting Napoleon come in there and take the supplies. Back in the day, you'd conquer a city, you'd take all their money, you'd take all their food, and you'd resupply your troops. The Russians don't allow that to happen. So as they get deeper and deeper into Russia, it gets colder and colder, and they all freeze to death. And what's crazy about history, and you're going to hear this theme from me all the time, history constantly repeats itself. Adolf Hitler is going to invade Russia in World War II, and he's going to make the same mistake, and the Russians are going to use the scorched earth policy again, and Hitler's going to lose World War II because his men freeze to death in the exact same manner. So moral of that story is, don't attack Russia in the dead of winter. And if you do, make sure you have a bunch of coats and food. All right? So eventually, he's going to get his butt kicked. His men freeze to death in Russia, and he's going to flee Russia. And as he's fleeing, all these other countries, England, Portugal, all these countries start hopping in, and they're chasing him back into France. And they capture Napoleon, and they send him to this island named Elba. Okay, it's way out in the middle of nowhere. Here's Elba right here's a picture. Island of Elba. And he basically went to like camp instead of prison. And he ends up escaping. He comes back. And he's going to get his army back together, and he's going to go, I'm going to conquer Europe again. And he goes out there, and he loses in one of the most famous battles in history. It's called the Battle of Waterloo. If you ever study military tactics, if you ever go to military school, if you ever become a general, you will learn about the Battle of Waterloo because he gets outflanked and outmaneuvered, and he gets boxed in. This time, the British sent him to St. Helena under much more lock and key, which is, again, as you can see, in the middle of nowhere. And that's where he's going to spend the rest of his life and his days. And Napoleon will die there. So what happens after this? Europe's kind of in shambles. Napoleon had conquered most of it. He had kicked out the kings and queens, or the kings and queens had fled to other countries. Like the king of Portugal had gone to their territory in Brazil to hide out. So now all these kings and queens are going to come back, and they're going to have this thing called the Congress of Vienna. Okay, and what is the Congress of Vienna? It's basically a meeting to put Europe back together. Okay, and it's going to do a couple of things. It's going to establish the balance of power in Europe and suppress France. Okay, it's going to give kings and queens of Europe their power back. Okay, so it restores all the power in Europe the way it was. And France is going to get a constitutional monarchy, which is crazy because that's what the people of France wanted in the first place. They never really wanted to kill and get rid of the king and queen. They just wanted some more rights and some more taxes. Okay, and all these things Napoleon implemented are going to be kept. But now there's a constitutional monarchy in France. Kings and queens are back in power. All the kings and queens are happy, or so you think. And what's crazy about the French Revolution and why we're learning about it is all these alliances are going to start forming because of Napoleon and the fear of like invasions of other countries. Napoleon created this nationalism throughout Europe, and there's going to be this huge military buildup directly caused by the Industrial Revolution, which is what we're going to learn about next. And these events are all going to lead to World War I, where millions and millions and millions of people die. And it kind of gets the ball rolling here with these wars and what are called the Napoleonic Wars and Napoleon trying to invade Europe. And that is the entire French Revolution done in under 17 minutes. I apologize for going over. So let's do a quick review. And everything I gave you are all the answers to the tests. Check this out. Let's do it one more time. You have poor taxes, taxing the poor so much they can't afford food. They want a constitutional monarchy. The king kind of laughs it off. He tries to escape. He gets put on trial. He gets beheaded. Maximilian Robespierre starts the Reign of Terror with the Committee of Public Safety and the Jacobins. They cut everybody's heads off so much that even Maximilian Robespierre gets his head cut off. Napoleon comes in, does a coup d'etat, creates nationalism, but creates a Napoleonic Code, which creates all these awesome things in France, but then he invades other countries. They're not happy. Everybody's fighting. He invades Russia. He fails miserably because everybody freezes to death. He evacuates. He gets kicked out to an island, escapes the island, comes back, loses again, gets kicked out again, this time for good. All the kings and queens come back. They take back all their power, and France gets a constitutional monarchy.